Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you doing?
I'm okay, Nicholas, and yourself?
I'm pretty good, as well as one can be on a Monday. And we're also joined today by John Endres. John, how are you, sir?
Very well, thank you. Cold feet in the morning, but it gets better during the course of the day.
Indeed, we are deep in the throes of autumn. And I'm not sure about this segue, but perhaps in the autumn of his political career is former President Thabo Mbeki, who has been on the campaign trail for the ANC recently. Now, this is quite significant because after a absence from sort of being a big cheerleader of the ANC during the Zuma years, and in fact, even into the first half of the Ramaphosa administration, Mbeki is emerging now as a big campaigner for the ANC on their election campaign. He's been active, particularly in Gauteng. He's been on the streets of Soweto recently, campaigning for the ANC. And this is important because I believe there is some opinion polling now to suggest that Thabo Mbeki is, in fact, the country's most popular political leader, this overtaking Cyril Ramaphosa, who was until quite recently the country's most popular political leader, but has since steadily fallen. In recent comments, however, Mbeki has said some rather strange things. Notably, he says that Eskom is, in fact, or at least during his tenure as president, deliberately engineered the electricity crisis of load shedding. He goes on to talk specifically about how the Eskom board was made aware that there was problems with coal supply, and rather than telling the Eskom operational employees about this and allowing them to plan and fix the problem ahead of time back in 2007, that they ignored this, deliberately not telling them so as to cause some sort of crisis. He also talks about how BEE rules were used as a sort of technical way of preventing the construction of the Kusile coal power station, which is one of South Africa's big new coal power plants that has been enormously delayed. He goes on to talk about how there were sort of irregularities with the contract, and then there was a sudden ask for a BE partner sort of halfway through the project. And the sort of upshot of all this is he basically concludes that there was some sort of deliberate attempt to sabotage the country, and that this fits into a grand conspiratorial narrative. Now, this is not the first time we've seen sort of weird conspiratorial emanations from Mbeki. Of course, he famously declared that HIV/AIDS was sort of hyped up by Western pharmaceutical companies to get Africa to buy pharmaceuticals that it didn't need, which has very likely led to the deaths of many thousands of people. He also has often accused various groups and peoples of being either CIA agents or counter-revolutionaries or something like that. So let me start with you, John. What do you make of these comments? I mean, firstly, do you put any plausibility in them that there was some sort of deliberate attempt to sabotage the country's electricity supply? I see that there is an energy expert being quoted in the media saying that it's quote unquote plausible. I think, though, that this very much feels like an attempt to sort of ignore the larger underlying problems here. What do you make of this?
I share your sentiments here, Nicholas. I think that President Mbeki, I think, is caught in a bit of Cold War paranoia and tends to see conspiracies where maybe ineptitude, incompetence, and greed suffices to explain the developments. And it forms a broader part of the narrative that we saw coming out of the speech that he prepared for the 30-year anniversary of South Africa's democracy, which quoted quite extensively, once again, that third age theory that we developed at the IRR that suggests that there was a pretty good first half of democracy in South Africa and a pretty bad second half of democracy. And the explanation that former President Mbeki has been finding for that is that the first good half was due to proper revolutionary policies of the kind that, under his wise leadership, were introduced in South Africa between 1994 and 2007, 2008, and a second half that was dominated by counter-revolutionary forces in the form of the other former president, Jacob Zuma, who foiled his attempts at introducing the revolution to South Africa. And I think, in a way, this is, it's a pat explanation for what happened, and one that serves his own interests, but that falls far short of the real explanation. The energy expert that you cite was, I think, also quite circumspect in endorsing President Mbeki's theory, because he says Mbeki would not make these comments without credible information. Well, who knows? Maybe he would. So I'm not entirely convinced by that. And I think, ultimately what happened since Jacob Zuma took power is that we had a combination of greed and ineptitude in mésalliance with socialist tendencies being used to capture the state and extract as much money out of it as possible. And that really explains most of what happened, rather than a counter-revolutionary conspiracy. Nick?
Yeah, it's very difficult to not see this as kind of Mbeki attempting, I think, to rescue his reputation. I think he felt very personally slighted by everything that happened at the end of his presidency there. I remember, of course, that Zapiro cartoon where, as Mbeki was departing office, I think he said something along the lines of "History will judge me," and Zapiro drew a cartoon showing history judging him with an F. So a lot of this just seems like kind of a personal thing of saying, you see, everything was great under me, and then we stopped trusting in me, and then everything went wrong. I don't know. Terence, am I being too simplistic there? I think, Mbeki continues to be the sort of paradox of a leader. In some ways, he was pretty successful as a South African president. Crime went down massively under his tenure. Unemployment went down massively under his, not massively, but unemployment went down. Economic growth surged. But he also, in so many ways, laid the foundations for the bad policy framework we have today. What do you make of all this, Terence?
I think that as somebody who read a great deal of Mbeki's stuff back in the day, there's almost sort of nostalgia here reading this. It's very much what you would have expected in 1997. Now, Mbeki has, I think, been accused of harboring a range of neuroses, which I don't think is entirely incorrect, of being extremely personally sensitive. Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert remarked that he was the only person who let him, van Zyl-Slabbert, know that my friendship was entirely dispensable. There's various stories like that. I've heard that from a number of sources who interacted with him, that he had couldn't deal with this person, couldn't deal with that person, and etc. 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 But I think here, I think what you have here is something that that you and I wrote about a couple of years ago when we were talking about fake news, and it's the concept of narrative. How you put things together to create a broader meaning. And I think that what I see here is somebody who can't escape from his ideological straitjacket. So yes, you have this counter-revolution, and that how can well-organized and disciplined revolutionary heroes come to this? Well, we've got this counter-revolution which he seems to blend seamlessly from Vlakplaas hitmen through to Jacob Zuma, without explicitly saying so. But the counter-revolution determined in 2002 to replace the leadership of the ANC, which I can only think is a reference to somehow Jacob Zuma, who was the head of ANC intelligence. But on Eskom, no. And he says, well, there's this myth going around that we didn't listen to Eskom. Well, if I may, he said this, I think it was in 2008, when Eskom said to government, we think we must invest more in terms of electricity generation. We said no, but all you will be doing is to build excess capacity. We said not now, later, we were wrong. Eskom was right, we were wrong. And I think that's the only time he ever apologized for anything, or expressed the view that that he had got it wrong. But I think what you're seeing here, I think, is a kind of reversion to type, because this is pretty much the universe of Mbeki's thinking on domestic matters. P.W. Botha was described as having a dogmatic view of geopolitics. So Gonzalo Sabbat again said he believes that if everything goes right, it's because of good government, and if something goes wrong, it's because there's an enemy. And I think fundamentally there's something comparable about Mbeki. I think the ANC does kind of need him because people do look back, and those were some good years. I mean, I often attest to this. You just look at some of the major shopping malls in South Africa now, the shuttered window fronts, as opposed to what those same places looked like in 2004, 2005. South Africa was sort of booming in those years, and I think Mbeki desperately wants his reputation back. I think that certainly there was a higher caliber of person functioning, but let's also remember Mbeki was the guy who said, "Just trust me about Jackie Selebi, the first Interpol head of Interpol to be jailed for corruption." Um, there was also the question of we had these revenues, something else he talks about, which largely flowed off the back of the commodities boom. While we didn't significantly expand our commodity output, merely our commodity receipts. So yes, I think that I don't know. Had Mbeki continued, perhaps things would be better. But I think that many of our problems owe to structural and legislative factors that he simply viewed as beneath any discussion.
Right. I think it's kind of interesting and actually slightly surprising to me, I guess, a little bit that his own analysis of things doesn't seem to have kind of prized apart what worked about um, his tenure and what didn't. And in many ways, as he decries this counter-revolution stuff, much of what Jacob Zuma did was simply follow through to the next logical step of many of the things that Mbeki had kind of put in place.
If I may, there's something else here. There's another point he makes there about how Eskom didn't have the skills to manage this, this complex project that they set in motion. It was Mbeki, I think, in 1997, who told Parliament that all this talk about skills was merely transformatory racism.
Right, exactly. I think that's a great example of that sort of thing. John, any final thoughts on this one before we move on?
Well, maybe just the idea of how ambiguous Mbeki must be feeling about campaigning for the ANC now. Having, I think, just a year ago said, if I get asked to campaign for the ANC and I go to a given town, I don't know how I can, in good faith, ask people to vote for the people in that town, knowing that they're involved in corruption. So he seems to have overcome his distaste in some way, magically, and gone out to bat for the ANC again. But he must be feeling a little bit awkward about it.
Which is perhaps why he's spending a lot of time talking about his time as president. That way he doesn't have to talk too much about what's going on currently. Speaking of what's going on currently, there's a bit of a scandal going on with regards to relating to the case that involved the murdered whistleblower Babita Deokaran. She's perhaps one of South Africa's most famous whistleblowers. She blew the whistle on the Tembisa hospital, essentially buying ridiculously overinflated goods, and that this was being channeled into the pockets of the senior management there. One instance that's repeated in the News 24 story on this is when surgical drapes had their price gouged by 2,000% markup from what they should have been. You had cases where Tembisa Hospital was buying equipment for 4,700 Rand, whereas it costs a private hospital 240 Rand to buy the same thing. Obviously, corruption there. However, one of the main people implicated in that corruption drive was Ashley Mthunzi, who was the CEO of Tembisa Hospital, who was under a disciplinary hearing relating to some of these charges and has been suspected or was suspected of somehow being involved in the murder. As the judge at the murder of Babita Deokaran pointed out, is that while they had arrested the gunman who had pulled the trigger, the true mastermind was never really charged. Anyway, the CEO passed away before the disciplinary completed, dragged on for 2 years, and is now going to receive 2.5 million Rand for no work done while suspended, and his estate will get a significant amount of payout from the government pension fund. The Babita Deokaran's family is very upset about this. They said, and this is me quoting from their statement, Tunzi may have not paid his dues here on earth, but he will pay for it in the afterlife, and he is hopefully burning in hell. It has been almost 3 years after our sister was murdered, but our anger has not subsided. Pretty harsh words, but I completely understand that sentiment. This really just kind of seems unfair. John, what do you make of this?
I think in a way this is an NHI story, or it should be one at least, where we've had these assurances from Nicholas Crisp, the main promoter of the NHI, that concerns that the public might have about irregular expenditure and things not being done properly in the public health sector would be addressed once the NHI had been introduced with its vast pools of money. And I think stories like this just show what's going to happen. You're going to have whistleblowers being killed left, right, and center. Corruption just taking completely crazy volumes, and that is a real problem. In this case, we see that there were, I think, 2 people who are suspended, who are suspected of having been involved in this, and they were credibly accused of corruption, under investigation for 2 years, 3 years, being paid their salaries during this time, receiving a pension payout if they pass away, like the person you mentioned did. And that is really quite outrageous, because even the public sector is able to dismiss people quickly if they do not perform or are involved in irregularities, as it shows when it dismisses whistleblowers, for example, which can be done very quickly. But as soon as a corrupt person is involved, that person is suspended on full pay for years sometimes, and that really is quite an outrage. And I think the ANC should own that. That really is part of their policy. It's been on display again and again, and no amount of denials will make that go away.
Exactly. This is the consequence of the policy of cadre deployment. When you appoint people into senior positions all over government, all over civil society, all over the bureaucracy, based off of some sort of political connection, based off of political loyalty, you get these conflicts of interest where there is an extremely credible case here that some of the people implicated in this corruption may also have been the ones to order this hit on Babita Deokaran. And everything just drags and it goes on and on and on, and people get paid money, and those responsible for this wrongdoing just don't get caught and don't get charged, even though it's pretty obvious who at least the suspicions should fall on. The real negative consequence of this, I think, is that, among other things, if you're a whistleblower and you work for the state right now, are you going to come forward, Terence, and say, yeah, no, this person is involved in corruption, knowing that this is the consequence of what might happen? You might get killed, and the person you accuse might go on to receive all the financial benefits.
There's a huge irony here, because there is legislation to deal with that sort of thing was introduced in the 1990s. Public Disclosure of Information, or Freedom of Information Act, Promotion of Access to Information Act, whistleblower protection, none of which has been especially useful. Look, I think what I would perhaps push back a little bit and say cadre deployment is part of the problem here, in the sense that it's undermined the what may have been very tenuous initial professionalism in the civil service. What you have now, I think, is as that professionalism, that professional culture was never formed, was never consolidated. It's now been sort of penetrated by criminal syndicates, and I think a lot of these guys are just in the pockets of mafiosi who are quite happy, really don't care who sits in the union buildings. But yeah, I mean, this is the thing for a crime of that severity. And even if there had been no murder, simply the volume of fraudulent spending, that should have been dealt with, within a month. But we've had case after case after case of this, where people can sort of game the system for years and years, sitting at home, playing PlayStation or whatever. And this is not a new phenomenon. There was a case in the early 2000s. This was over the Mbeki period. I think there's a correctional services chap in Natal. I think he was eventually dismissed after being on leave for 5 years, or for 9 years, or something ridiculous like that. So yes, John is quite correct. You can take action if you choose to, and I think this sends a wonderful message that if you are fingered, you will be treated with the sort of full consideration of your dignity, which will not apply to the guy lying in the gutter with a bullet in his back, or in this case, a car seat with a it's that story actually has echoed around the world. I've been at conferences, and there are people from elsewhere in this continent who know Babita Deokaran's name, and spoken with reverence and awe. You can go into YouTube and see interviews with her daughter, and with her family members. This was someone who was trying to do the right thing. You want to talk revolutionary morality? Well, there it was. It's
John?
It's beyond tragic.
Indeed. Any final thoughts on this one before we move on to our last topic?
Well, I think it's also helpful to look at the story as one of the failure of law enforcement and prosecution. So when you think about the story, the one is like the NHI story. The second is suspending people credibly accused of wrongdoing and allowing them to draw benefits for a long period of time. And the third is the failure of law enforcement and prosecution to act swiftly in the interest of justice.
If I may just make one concluding comment to tie it back to what we were saying about Mr. Mbeki. Mavuso Msimang, who is often seen as a kind of avatar of righteousness and morality, and I think as far as I know, he seems to be a good guy. He very dramatically resigned from the ANC, then rescinded a couple of days later, saying, well, he's received assurances that they won't allow people on their lists who are accused by the Zondo Commission unless they presented themselves to the Integrity Commission. Well, that hasn't happened. He was actually asked a couple of days ago, what about this? And he said, obviously it's very disappointing, but I still believe the ANC will do the right thing. This is a religious faith, not it has no basis in evidence. And I say that without any malice to a guy who I think is probably really a good human being. Unfortunately, if good human beings are willing to let it go and let it go and let it go, we can expect this to happen repeatedly.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's talk a little bit about how the elections are shaping up. We are still continuing to watch the polling that is coming out. There's this poll from Ipsos, which, Ipsos so far this election period has tended to be a little bit out from some of the other polls, for example, from the Social Research Foundation polls. But their latest poll, I think, was much closer to what a lot of the other polls from the Braintrust Foundation, the Social Research Foundation, and such have suggested. Now, it's complicated, but basically they predict a pretty bad result for the ANC, below 45%, and there does seem to be some concern within the ANC. There's reporting that they are really trying to make up for losses in provinces like KZN and Gauteng by going out to some of their rural strongholds. And indeed, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that particularly in Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and the Eastern Cape, the ANC remains pretty much uncontested, particularly in the areas that they were already strongest in. We've seen by-elections and things held in those provinces where the ANC is, getting north of 80%, 85% of the vote in some of its strongholds. Doesn't seem to be much challenge from the EFF or MK or any of these other parties. The ANC is also now currently talking about how they are sort of spinning the story that the MK party is imploding due to infighting. Now, we've talked a little bit about the infighting in MK, and I think that definitely could hurt the party, but imploding is, I think, definitely a step too far. I do not think the MK party is imploding whatsoever. It remains to be seen, however, But there's a big turnout operation that the ANC says they are deploying in Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga, and they are putting out all of their sort of former bigwigs on the campaign trail. In Tshwane, they put David Mabuza, they put Kgatlema Motlanthe out there, and they put Thabo Mbeki, as we talked about in the first story, out on the campaign trail. Terence, let me start with you. This does seem to be, a confirmation, and we'll find out the truth of these things once we get to the election results. But one of our views of the ANC and a lot of our analysis has been that they are increasingly turning into a sort of rural party. There was a time when the ANC was strongest actually in urban areas, and the rural areas were sort of the part of the country the ANC was worried about losing. And this has very much reversed now, where the ANC seems to be in retreat across a lot of urban South Africa, while at the same time maintaining its hold over the rural parts of the country. What do you make of this, Terence?
Look, I would say that it's not so much it's in retreat as being increasingly challenged. I think that it's less the guys who voted for the ANC in Soweto, for instance, for 20 years who won't vote for it anymore, but new generations and changing dynamics. But yeah, look, I think there's two things going on with the Eastern Cape. First of all, you're quite correct. The ANC in many ways is becoming rather like one of those old Bantustan parties, very clientelistic, transactional. I think it's trying to trade on past glories, and I think also to some extent trying to trade on sort of ethnic racial chauvinism. I think the other thing is that, remember, the Eastern Cape was, let's say, Mbeki's stomping ground. That wasn't that was less hospitable than KwaZulu-Natal to Zuma. The Zuma phenomenon was interesting because, for about 10 years, KwaZulu-Natal was seen as fairly inhospitable, to some extent because the IFP was able to use its organizational presence. I think also the appeal of Zulu ethnicity. When you had an ANC guy doing that and promising that he's got more goodies, that became a very attractive option to many people there. And I think this is probably what they're hoping that they can force something, force a sort of, call this a counter revolution to the counter revolution. The other thing, interestingly, if you look at the MK manifesto, and I wrote about it today in the Daily Friend, it is very much tailored. There's a lot of it that is very tailored to rural interests. And I think that they are afraid not only of losing the kind of urban support in KZN, but also a big chunk of their rural support. So yeah, you're gonna want to get out the vote wherever you can. Go TV, as they say.
I think that is MK is a little bit different from a lot of the other parties. The EFF, Action SA, some places the DA have all managed to challenge the ANC in its urban environments with varying degrees of success. But the MK party is taking away what for a while I think was the party's biggest sort of bulwark. The ANC, as you said, didn't have KZN in its corner. Then Zuma comes in, it takes over KZN, it becomes this huge party in KZN. KZN puts in lots of votes for the ANC that actually cover its losses in other parts of the country. And now it seems to be slipping out of their control again, which is I think one of the reasons why the polling is suggesting the ANC is in such trouble at the moment. John, what do you make of all this?
I think one interesting aspect here is the question of whether you preach to the converted or you preach to the heathens. And the ANC is trying to fill its church with voters. And I think it has now decided that it is going to be preaching to the converted, that being its supporters in Mpumalanga, Limpopo, Eastern Cape, because that is how it's going to get its church the fullest. It's going to get the most voters by turning out the vote, rather than trying to convince people who are wavering or already voting for other parties to come to the ANC. And that's a defensive move. I think it shows the party is under pressure. And that, together with Terence's observation about this shift, and your observation, this shift to rural rather than urban support base, I think is going to be a long-term, really important trend for the ANC. So the country is still urbanizing. People are still moving to the cities. Rural areas are becoming less and less important in terms of voter numbers, but that is where support for the ANC is. So it's really getting squeezed by demographics, and is going to find that quite tricky, I think, in future elections. Nick?
Yeah, it's worth remembering that there's many South Africans, I think, who have this idea that rural South Africa is still this sort of vast space where the majority of people live. That's not really that true anymore. You look at the most urbanized province is Gauteng, and something like a quarter of the entire population lives just in Gauteng. The Western Cape is about 12% of the population, and a lot of that is also quite urban. So South Africa is much more an urban country than it is actually a rural country, and that, as you said, John, is that's been a long-term trend, and it's not going away anytime soon. In fact, as South Africa's rural areas become more desolate, madly managed, economically depressed, those trends are in many ways only accelerating. Because if you're growing up in rural Limpopo, if you don't move to Joburg or Polokwane or Cape Town or literally any of the big cities, your prospects for a better life are, shall we say, a bit thin. Terence, any final thoughts for today before we close up?
No. Look, I just because I'm old enough to remember this. I do remember the polling before the 1994 election that predicted that IFP would get 1% of the vote, 2% of the vote. I also remember taking a trip into the rural hinterland of KwaZulu, and I remember going over a rise, and there was this sea of sort of mud houses, huts, or whatever. It just not little homesteads, but it wasn't sort of like one sort of building in a vast expanse of openness. It was dense. This was essentially like a town. It just wasn't recognized as a town. And I remember thinking that these people are probably escaping below the radar. And I think that the importance of that rural vote has been shown. It was certainly shown in 1994, and I think has been shown again and again. It will be very important for the ANC.
All right, that is all the time we have for today. We hope you found the show interesting. We will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friend Wrap. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Cheers, everyone.